Far-right parties pushing nationalist, anti-immigration policies are on the rise in Western democracies around the globe. Here, recent polling indicates support for One Nation has doubled since the last election, and the party is even boasting that more people are paying to sign up. So could Pauline Hanson's One Nation grow to pose a similar threat, like Nigel Farage's reform now poses in the UK? Today, I'm talking to Deputy Editor Patrick Keneally and Head of Newsroom Mike Ticher about the rise of the populist right and the lessons for Australia and the Albanese government. Hi, Mike.
Morning, Nour.
Hey, Pat.
Morning, Nour.
So far-right populist parties are surging around the world. The Albanese government's win at the last election was interpreted by many as a rejection of Trumpian politics. But there are some signs of an electoral shift on the right. What's polling showing us?
So, first caveat, it's only 6 months since the election. It's only opinion polls. It's not an actual election. But the recent polls have been quite striking, I think, in that they've shown Labor sort of edging up a little bit into the mid-30s, Coalition losing sort of 5-ish% down to the high 20s, and One Nation gaining significantly on the 6.4% they had at the actual election in May to somewhere up around 11-12% in some polls. So obviously that's quite a big shift. It appears like they're mostly taking it from the Coalition. People are thinking about that in terms of what's happening in other parts of the world where the radical right and in some cases the far right has been gaining both in polling and in actual elections in various countries.
I think it's important to keep this kind of polling in perspective. So it's around 11%. One Nation's biggest support ever at a state or federal level was the 98 Queensland election, where they got about 22% of the vote. It's nowhere near that. When we look around the world as well, far-right parties in Europe are polling kind of 20-30% in some cases. So we really still have a very long way to go, and I don't think we should overreact to these type of polling at this stage.
With all those caveats in mind, what could be driving that?
Well, I think there are two issues that are mostly animating the right in general, very broadly speaking, at the moment, in Australia at least. One is common to countries, almost all countries around the world, which is immigration. And the other is net zero and climate change. But I think migration is probably the one that has driven that upswell in support most in European countries, particularly in the UK at the moment. And to some extent that's been replicated in Australia. There have been, the Coalition has made a lot about the number of migrants that are allowed. The further right parties have obviously, that's a huge thing for them, and often couched in, quite lurid terms. But what we don't have, at least compared to the UK, which I think is probably the most interesting comparison country at the moment, is the concern about quote unquote unauthorised arrivals, boat arrivals essentially, which of course we have been through in the past 20 years, but because with Labor and the Coalition basically having a bipartisan policy on that now, after much torturous agonies on the Labor side for several elections now, they've signed up essentially to the Coalition's policy brought in the Howard and Abbott years and given them a space to work in on migration that UK Labor does not have at the moment.
I think there's two kind of strands. As Mike mentioned, there's all these global things like the rise of nativism, probably some economic concerns in there as well. If you look at, the policies of One Nation, there are a lot of them about like bringing back manufacturing jobs, which is something we've seen with Make America Great in the US and Trump. But there's also local issues here, and a lot of them are to do, I think, with the collapse or the implosion of the Liberal and National parties at a federal level, which has actually created that space for One Nation to, win supporters. And back to the global, I think, there is a rejection amongst some of this kind of liberal democratic values that have propelled Western democracies for decades. overseas, they've been driven to people like Donald Trump or Nigel Farage, but here they express their distaste for, regular electoral politics by voting for small parties like One Nation. In the past, there have been other smaller parties like Family First on the right, but really now what we're seeing is, I think, all those voters coalescing around One Nation as the clear inheritor of all those different strands.
That's true in terms of the polling, but big divisions within some of those parties as well, like Alex Antich, for example, who's in the Liberal Party, but you would probably put more in the basket of radical right, you might call it. So it's extremely fractured, and although One Nation has seen this large rise in its opinion poll numbers, I think it's still very questionable whether they can actually, extremely doubtful, in fact, whether they can capture the whole or a large part of that spectrum of opinion that is, as you would say, to the right of the moderate libs, the mainstream libs, sort of exemplified by the current leadership.
And even if they can capture it, do they have the discipline to actually hold that together? They've never really shown that discipline that I think, certainly the MAGA wing of the Republicans in the US has shown. We're yet to see if Reform can hold it together until a general election. It's still a long way off in the UK. That's an open question. But here, we've seen it over and over again that when, particularly One Nation, because they have such a personality-based party around Pauline Hanson, they are quick to kind of things fall apart, I guess.
Pat, you alluded to this earlier. Reform has had a massive bump in the polls in the UK at 31%, putting it ahead of Labor and the Conservatives. That would have been unimaginable just a couple of years ago. Keir Starmer has been criticised for how he's responded to the rise of Reform. Critics have accused him of moving too far to the right in an attempt to curtail Farage, and in the end, giving credence to their far-right talking points. How has Labor gone about that here? And is there a risk and a danger that Anthony Albanese could fall into a similar trap?
Yeah, I think it's probably worth going over just briefly Starmer's response in the UK. So in May, he delivered a speech and used a phrase, an island of strangers, saying that Britain risks becoming an island of strangers, which, in many ways echoed Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. He later said he regretted using that turn of phrase, but I think Labor in the UK is legitimising this debate in a way that actually harms them. They've also done things like put out videos of the Home Office deporting asylum seekers in the UK, and that's been criticised by backbenchers in Labor, who say, look, no matter how many farms we raid for illegal migrants, no matter how many of these videos we put out, no matter how tough we appear on immigration, we're always going to be outflanked by Reform, who are going to propose even tougher, even more draconian things. As far as it goes to Labor here, look, it's always been a difficult issue for the ALP in Australia. And there's always been a threat from One Nation and other minor parties on the issue. But I think largely their strategy is pretty good. They try and reinforce the facts about the numbers of immigrants who are coming to Australia, what they contribute to Australia. I think there's been a good recognition of that and a good discussion about that. But I don't think they should mirror what UK Labor is trying to do by acting tougher and tougher, because it just shifts the kind of focus of the debate onto their turf, really.
Mike, some have suggested that Labor's attempting to starve conversations around immigration of oxygen, that has been its strategy. Does that kind of caution or timidity play into the hands of the far right? In researching for this episode, you would have both seen some of the comments that Paul Keating made when he was PM, describing Pauline Hanson's politics as shamelessly regressive, rooted in ignorance, prejudice and fear. You couldn't imagine that being said nowadays, could you?
I don't think that's so far from how some people might describe her politics, maybe not quite in such Paul Keating-esque terms. But I think this goes back to the question of boat arrivals and Labor agreeing to adopt the Operation Sovereign Borders policies begun by the coalition. When looking at this, you have to acknowledge that that entails cruelties, and there are things that happen on Nauru to people who try to come to Australia for asylum that should be held under the microscope and criticised for the damage that they do to people and who are held in those conditions and who have been in detention on Nauru or previously in PNG as well. The ramifications of Australia's system over many years have been terrible for a lot of people. Having said that, having signed up to that policy, circumstances in Australia have given Labor the opportunity to make that really clear divide between quote unquote legal and illegal migration, and to say we're tough on people who try to come here through unauthorised methods. We don't resile from that at all. They don't particularly want to talk about it, as you said. It's never been a good electoral issue for Labor, but they're not going to change their policy on that, and that has allowed them to talk positively about migration in general. To be clear, as Patrick said, about the numbers, whether they're going up or down, what are the components of our migration intake, and to talk positively about the contribution that migrants have made to this country, which is, among many parts of the population, is received positively and is not controversial. And that is the one thing that Labor here does have going for it.
Was really interested in that Keating quote. The end of that, he says, the great tragedy is that One Nation and their arguments perpetuate a myth, a fantasy, a lie. Because a lot of this is, promoting this nostalgia of an Australia that never really was. And I was reminded of that by Andrew Hastie, who's now previous frontbencher, who's now on the Coalition's backbench, who put up this weird Instagram post where he was standing next to a vintage Ford that was manufactured in Australia in the 1970s and talking about why can't we have a car industry here? Why can't we bring back manufacturing?
And saying Australians would be strangers in their own country.
Yeah. So echoing those kind of words. But it's this sense of nostalgia, I think, that they're feeding into. You're selling a lie, you're selling a fantasy, and I think that quote from Keating was really prescient on that.
So does the populist threat come from within the Liberal Party itself? Is Andrew Hastie trying to position himself as Australia's Nigel Farage? Yeah,
it's an interesting one. I don't think he has this sounds quite blunt, but I don't think he has the charisma to be Nigel Farage. Like, I think one thing that Nigel Farage and Donald Trump share is they're actually, like, they're big characters. They fill a room. They have the gift of the gab. But Andrew Hastie, I haven't really seen that yet. I don't know, Mike, if you disagree.
I don't disagree with that for sure. But I think that the interesting thing is, like, how does he or anyone else who might see themselves in that role see this going? Because in countries where the politics has moved significantly to the populist right, I think we've seen two kind of iterations of it. One in the US, where an established party has been essentially taken over by the extreme right. Another more in the European cases, it's much more that a new party has grown up outside the old system and has cannibalised the support for the established parties in the UK. What does Andrew Hastie or someone like him do? They have to try to straddle, if they want to be Liberal leader, they have to try to straddle quite a broad range of opinion, from the sort of moderates edging into where the Teals are, all the way to some of the more. But it's Barnaby Joyce and then Matt Canavan in the Nationals, or Alex Antich in the Liberals. That's a big spectrum of opinion to straddle. If you want to be the leader, it's hard to see how you do that in a kind of Nigel Farage populist way. You
can see a path, though, if they decide they don't want to win back the Teal seats like Peter Dutton basically did. You could see how a hollowed out party structure, one that's in disarray in Victoria, is under administration in New South Wales. Like, the party apparatus is not in good health. You can see how Conservatives could not only take over the leadership, but actually take over the mechanics of a party that's membership is actually quite far to the Conservative side, and old and white generally. So I don't think it's beyond possibility that they could radically reshape the party in the Conservative direction and just forget about the Liberal wing of it.
I think that I totally agree with that, but I'm not sure if that would be a successful
whether it would lead to electoral success. Yeah. Dubious at
because
best.
Then they're kind of competing more with the fringe parties further to their right, and they're losing voters who believe in climate change. So yes, it could happen, but I don't think it's a successful formula for the Liberal Party.
We've been here before in many ways, in that in 98 with the state election in Queensland, One Nation's big electoral success in that they won, I think, about 11 MPs, damaged the coalition parties so much there that they spent the next 10 years sort of arguing with each other, Liberals and Nationals, and they ended up merging. So you can see how the rise of One Nation is actually kind of an existential threat to the Liberal Party as a brand, it may end up in, the Liberal Party or the National Party ceasing to be independent parties.
And we're seeing that, in a sense, play out in real time with Andrew Hastie moving to the backbench and so much of that being linked to immigration. What is different about our electoral system and our social and political conditions that might set Australia apart?
So I think there are some clear parallels between Australia and the UK, and also some very stark differences. So the differences obviously are the Labor government in Australia has proven itself more basically competent and not prone to disaster in the same way that Keir Starmer's Labor Party has in its first year and a bit. But also the vote share for reform in the polls has eaten into the Labor Party's vote in the UK way more than One Nation's has in Australia. But I do think there's a warning for Australian Labor there that they are not necessarily just a thing about the right dividing up their regular share of the vote. Potentially, there is also the potential for right-wing parties, and maybe not One Nation specifically, but parties, populist, nativist parties, to eat into the mainstream left-wing vote as well.
So you also asked about how that could translate into seats, and I think a really big difference, obviously, between Australia and countries overseas is our optional preferential voting system. In the UK, they have a system called first past the post. We could talk electoral systems all day, but I think that the takeaway from it is that really it's much harder in Australia to get a seat when you only have sort of, 20 to 30% of the vote, because there'll be a bloc often that coalesces around a major party, so Labor or the coalition. It's been a kind of steadying influence, I think, on Australian democracy for a while now.
Before we wrap up, let's talk briefly about the role of the media and the responsibility of the media, because sometimes anti-immigration sentiment is fueled by parts of the media, also social media. What responsibility lies with journalists to ensure that disinformation campaigns and that sensationalist coverage of immigration are challenged and are critiqued?
I think you need to, with most things, put the facts first. And, in immigration, I think we've been doing that at The Guardian, doing explainers, pieces of analysis, looking at the numbers over time. Some of this is panic amongst elements of the media and political class has come from the post-COVID bounce in immigration numbers. They're now declining, and I think it's really important for media organisations to explain why that happened, and what the levels of immigration are going to now, and the benefits of it as well. Not just talk about immigration being a negative or a cost, actually looking at the upside of the ledger, what it brings to us economically, but also what it brings to us in terms of diversity and our community.
I mean, what we can't control, of course, and no one can control, is what happens online, on social media. And there are certainly parts of the radical right that are animated by movements that grow up really not out of sight of the mainstream media, but sort of out of the control of the mainstream media. All the mainstream parties come to that and grow organically online and are fed by misinformation, disinformation, by now obviously supercharged by AI, and fake information, lies, misleading information, and that's really hard to find a way to effectively counter that from the perspective of being in the mainstream media. And I think that feeds the more radical extremes of politics in Australia that we saw, for example, exemplified in the marches a while ago that included actual neo-Nazis speaking and attracted a lot of attention because there were a lot of people there by comparison with, previous iterations of that. Should keep that in perspective about how many people were there. It's still a very small minority, but nevertheless they were Nazis. And it feels like that part of the movement and the sort of drawing of other or previous people who would have voted for regular parties or had not had extreme opinions into that realm is driven a lot by what's going on online on social media. Whereas maybe, I don't know how successful One Nation and the more kind of conventional far-right parties have been in that sphere. So there are kind of fissures and divisions and fragmentation there as well, I think. But from the media's point of view, it's really hard to get a handle on what's going on there, and certainly to influence it, that's very difficult.
Just in terms of the responsibility of the media, but also the responsibility of politicians. John Harris, a writer in the UK who travels around the UK visiting different communities and talking to, he's spoken to thousands of people about these kind of issues. And he said in his most recent piece, politicians have given permission for old hatreds and prejudices to be given a 21st century refit, which I thought was really interesting, that a lot of this stuff that's happening is basically just giving people permission almost to be racist, to attack people on the street, to, rally outside refugee hotels, to make incendiary comments online. All of these things are given permission by the way that politicians talk and sometimes the way the media behaves as well.
Okay, now it's time for what you can't get out of your head. Pat, we might start with you.
Sure. On Wednesday, the boss of News Corp Australia got up and spoke at the University of Melbourne about, and he made some good points about AI companies stealing content from media companies, something we all obviously care about. But he also went on a tear about social media, blaming it for social cohesion issues around the world and radicalisation, some of which I think is true. But the curious thing about this is I think that News Corp is in the running to be one of the companies that takes over TikTok America. We don't know what version of TikTok we'll get in Australia. We might still get the Chinese run version. We may go to the American one, but I think it'll be funny if it's a News Corp run. Well, it won't be funny. It'll be quite, maybe damaging for our politics, but we'll see. But also, you can imagine a TikTok run by News Corp. It would be full of racing news and, NRL content and things. It'd be more like the Daily Telegraph and not like TikTok.
Isn't it ironic? Mike, what about you?
So mine is a completely different story. Just a nice story with no terrible shocks or horrors in it, although it seemed for a while as though there might be. So the scientist Fred Ramsdale was hiking in the backcountry of western US this week and had his phone turned off. He was on a complete digital detox. And then he and his wife stopped for a while and she turned on her phone and let out a shriek. And he thought at first it might be a bear, so he was alarmed. And then obviously when she saw her phone, usually when you let out a shriek or when you turn your phone on after it's been off for a long time, there's some horrific news. But in this case, it was great news that he was one of the winners of the Nobel Prize in medicine. So they'd been trying to find him for a couple of days, I think. He just had all these messages backed up on his phone saying congratulations and stuff. And so that was a lovely story. And also he got to turn his phone off again and continue his hike in the delightful backcountry of the Western US and just have a nice feeling about having won the Nobel Prize, I think. So that was a really nice story.
There might be a few more shrieks relating to Nobel Peace Prize announcements in the coming days, potentially. Mike, Patrick, thank you so much.
Thanks, Nour.
Thanks, Nour.